What if everything you think you know about women accused of heresy is just a fragment of a much darker truth, carefully shaped to hide what really happened to them? Imagine opening a history book and realizing that the most brutal details, the ones that could completely change how we understand the medieval world, were deliberately erased. This question is uncomfortable, but essential. Why were these women targeted with such intensity? And why did entire institutions commit so much effort to ensure their voices never survived? When we look back at ancient accusations of heresy, the official narratives seem almost too organized, too clean, too convenient. They portray these women as threats, as dangers to the social order, as shadows that needed to be contained. But when we begin peeling away the layers, the silence becomes louder than the written accounts. There are traces of fear, power, humiliation, and a system designed not just to condemn, but to destroy. Behind every accusation, there was a woman whose story was rewritten, manipulated, or buried. Not because she posed real danger, but because her existence contrariava normas that powerful men wanted to preserve. As we revisit these forgotten lives, the contradictions become impossible to ignore. How did ordinary women suddenly become symbols of chaos? How could midwives, healers, scholars, and even widows be transformed into heretics overnight? The answer is not in the acts they committed, but in the fear they provoked. Their knowledge, independence, or influence challenged structures built on obedience. When a woman stepped outside the lines, even discreetly, the system reacted with a ruthless efficiency that reveals more about the accusers than the accused. And this is where the truth begins to fracture the narrative we inherited. Because once we understand how these accusations were constructed, we also understand why the cruelty inflicted upon them had to be hidden. Records were edited, trials were manipulated, testimonies were coerced, and entire communities were encouraged to participate in the erasure. What remains today are fragments, clues, and whispers of stories, too disturbing for chroniclers to preserve in full. What you are about to uncover exposes not only the violence they endured, but the elaborate mechanisms that kept this violence hidden for centuries. Before we go deeper, I want to hear from you. Have you ever suspected that the official version of history might be hiding something far more disturbing? Your comment matters, because understanding this content together creates awareness about what was erased. Leave your thoughts, check if you are subscribed, and give a like so this discussion reaches more people who need to question these narratives. And as we follow these traces and unveil what was never meant to be known, a new layer of truth begins to surface, guiding us toward the next revelation that history tried so hard to keep buried. The image of the heretical woman did not emerge overnight. It was crafted slowly, intentionally, through centuries of fear, superstition, and institutional strategy. When we step back and observe how this figure was shaped, it becomes clear that the accusations were not random reactions to isolated behaviors. They were part of a broader system that needed an enemy, someone who could embody the anxieties of a society collapsing under its own contradictions. Women, particularly those who stood outside the expected roles, became the perfect canvas for these fears. The Church understood the power of narrative long before the modern world gave it a name. By framing dissenting women as heretics, as dangerous influences capable of destabilizing entire communities, the institution could maintain control while claiming moral superiority. The more mysterious a woman appeared, the more knowledge she possessed, the more independence she displayed, the easier it became to align her with forces described as threatening. Healers who used herbal remedies, widows who managed property, women who spoke too freely in public spaces, all were gradually pushed into a category that suggested risk, rebellion, or spiritual corruption. Throughout medieval sermons, manuscripts, and religious teachings, the idea of the woman who deviated from obedience evolved into something almost mythical. She became a symbol, a warning, a vessel through which fear could be communicated. The process was subtle enough to seem organic, yet deliberate enough to reshape collective imagination. It was no longer necessary to prove a woman guilty. The culture was already prepared to believe that guilt was inherent. Once that belief took root, her silence or defense mattered little, because the accusation itself served as the evidence. This construction of fear was reinforced through stories repeated in churches and public gatherings. These narratives often highlighted women as gateways to heresy, temptation, or disorder. The more these stories circulated, the more they justified the strict surveillance of female behavior. A woman who questioned authority could be framed as spiritually unstable. A woman who demonstrated knowledge outside the male-dominated structures could be described as suspicious. The rhetoric created an invisible cage, one that limited what women could be before society labeled them dangerous. As we look at how this mechanism operated, the parallels between accusation and control become impossible to ignore. The figure of the heretical woman became a tool that extended far beyond religion. It became a political weapon, a social boundary, a justification for intervention in private lives. The fear was not of her beliefs, but of her potential, her ability to think, influence, or resist. And once this image was firmly established, it provided the foundation for everything that came next, shaping the environment in which persecution could flourish with little resistance or questioning. Without breaking the flow, this reveals how deeply rooted these constructed fears were, and how they prepared the ground for what awaited the women who dared to exist outside the limits imposed on them, opening the path toward even more disturbing practices that were quietly normalized. When accusations of heresy were directed at women, the official records made the process appear orderly, almost judicial, as if every step followed a clear path of investigation and truth. But behind this polished facade existed a reality far more brutal, one that chroniclers intentionally softened or omitted. The persecution of these women did not begin with a trial. It began long before, in the shadows where suspicion was manufactured. The moment a woman attracted the wrong attention, a quiet machinery of intimidation moved into place, and her fate often unfolded without a single written line to defend her. The first stage of persecution relied on informal inquiries disguised as moral concern. Neighbors were questioned about her habits, her nighttime movements, the people she received in her home, or the remedies she offered to others. These inquiries were not neutral. They were crafted to extract fear, exaggeration, or resentment. A single whispered comment could become a building block for an accusation that seemed legitimate on paper, but was born from personal rivalries, jealousy, or frustration. Women who were independent or respected for their knowledge became prime targets because their existence alone challenged expectations. As this informal surveillance intensified, the next steps unfolded in private spaces where no witnesses existed. Clerics, local authorities, or influential men could summon a woman under the pretext of offering guidance, but the real purpose was to pressure her into confessing behaviors she never committed. These encounters were rarely documented, yet they played a critical role in shaping the accusations that would appear later in official records. Many women were threatened with social isolation, spiritual condemnation, or physical punishment if they refused to comply. By the time the formal accusation was written, the script had already been rehearsed through intimidation. Another method hidden by chroniclers was the strategic manipulation of testimony. Authorities often selected witnesses whose words aligned with the desired outcome. Testimonies could be recorded selectively, omitting anything that contradicted the narrative being constructed. In some cases, women were confronted with statements attributed to them that they never made, forcing them into a defensive position that reinforced the image of guilt. The written records we have today present these testimonies as unquestionable truth, yet they were shaped by hands that understood the power of omission. Material evidence was rarely necessary. Instead, symbolic objects were seized from a woman's home and reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion. A jar of herbs could be labeled as a tool of heretical practice. A book she inherited could be described as forbidden knowledge. Even ordinary household items became proof when placed in a context designed to incriminate. Chroniclers described these objects as signs of deviance, but they never questioned the intent behind the interpretation, revealing how the system relied on transforming everyday life into a narrative of danger. As these hidden methods accumulated, the persecution gained an air of inevitability. The woman was trapped in a process that had been crafted long before she ever spoke in her own defense. And the more we expose these concealed mechanisms, the clearer it becomes that what was presented as justice was, in truth, a carefully orchestrated path toward a predetermined end, leading directly into the even darker stages that awaited those who were accused. Long before a woman ever faced a tribunal, a silent violence had already begun shaping her destiny. This stage of persecution operated outside the official scripts, in spaces where no chronicler bothered to write what he witnessed, or perhaps chose not to. It was a violence that disguised itself as discipline, correction, or spiritual cleansing. But in truth, it served to break the woman, before she even had a chance to speak. Many of these acts were never described openly because they exposed the cruelty of the very institutions that claim to act in the name of virtue. Yet beneath the layers of caution and omission, the traces remain. When a woman was targeted, the first form of violence was isolation. She could be removed from her community in subtle ways that left no visible marks, but altered every part of her daily life. Friends distanced themselves, neighbors avoided her, and relatives were quietly encouraged to treat her with suspicion. This emotional dismantling was intentional. The goal was to weaken her social standing so profoundly that by the time the formal accusation appeared, she had already lost the support that could have defended her. Isolation itself acted as a verdict long before any judgment was written. As suspicion grew, the second layer of violence emerged: public humiliation, disguised as moral correction. Some women were summoned for interrogations conducted not in private chambers, but in communal settings, where their posture, tone, and expressions were evaluated by people instructed to detect signs of rebellion or deceit. These sessions were not meant to find truth. They were meant to create fear. A woman confronted by authority in public lost control of her own narrative. Even silence could be interpreted as defiance, while tears were seen as proof of guilt. Chroniclers rarely mentioned these scenes because they revealed too clearly how accusation relied on humiliation rather than evidence. Physical coercion also entered this stage in ways that were deliberately concealed. Before any official tortures took place, authorities often used lesser forms of force to intimidate the accused. They could restrain her, confine her without record, or keep her awake through prolonged questioning that left her exhausted and confused. These methods were effective precisely because they left no visible scars and no formal trace. By the time she arrived at the tribunal, her body and mind had already endured the weight of this invisible struggle, shaping her responses and making her appear inconsistent or unstable. Another form of violence emerged through manipulation of her daily environment. Food could be withheld, visits denied, letters intercepted, and possessions confiscated under the pretext of safeguarding her soul. These intrusions blurred the line between moral discipline and deliberate degradation. They ensured that the woman felt powerless in every aspect of her life. Chroniclers preferred to present the accused as fragile, nervous, or irrational during trials, ignoring the systematic dismantling that produced such behavior long before the proceedings began. All these hidden mechanisms served a single purpose: to erode resilience. The woman who finally stood before a tribunal was already broken by a process that the official records refused to acknowledge. And as this pattern becomes more visible, it exposes how the darkest parts of persecution happen not under the courtroom's gaze, but in the spaces where silence protected the perpetrators. Before we move deeper, tell me your thoughts. Does any part of this erased violence resonate with what you imagine truly happened? Leave a comment sharing what struck you most, because your perspective helps uncover what history tried to hide, and it strengthens this journey as we continue unfolding what awaited these women beyond the shadows already revealed. Behind every accusation of heresy against a woman, there was always a network of political motivations that shaped the narrative long before any spiritual argument entered the conversation. Medieval society was built on structures of power that feared instability, and a woman who stepped outside prescribed boundaries could unintentionally threaten alliances, inheritance lines, economic privileges, or local hierarchies. It was far easier for influential men to frame her as spiritually dangerous than to admit that the true conflict was rooted in politics, ambition, or the desire to silence a voice that disrupted established order. Once we understand this dynamic, the accusations become less about faith and more about control. In many regions, property played a central role in these hidden motivations. Widows who inherited land or wealth became targets not because of religious suspicion, but because their independence disrupted the flow of local power. A woman who could manage assets, negotiate agreements, or influence economic decisions was perceived as unpredictable. Accusing her of heresy provided a convenient path to confiscate her goods or transfer them to male relatives, the church, or local authorities. The trial offered a legal mask for what was essentially a political redistribution of resources. The same dynamic applied to women who held knowledge or influence within their communities. Midwives, healers, and educators posed a unique challenge to the structures that sought to centralize authority. Their ability to guide, comfort, or lead others created informal power networks outside the church's control. Accusing them of heresy dissolved these networks instantly. Their removal reasserted the dominance of male-dominated institutions and ensured that spiritual and social authority remained aligned with political interests. Chroniclers later softened these cases into moral lessons, avoiding any mention of the power struggles underlying them. Political alliances also shaped accusations in more subtle ways. During times of social unrest, leaders often looked for scapegoats who could absorb collective anxieties. Women on the margins of society became the easiest targets, because their voices carried the least protection. Accusations served as symbolic gestures to reassure the population that authorities were acting decisively. By converting political instability into a moral crisis focused on female behavior, officials redirected public attention away from their own failures and weaknesses. The more dramatic the accusation, the more effectively it masked internal turmoil. Even personal disputes were woven into these political strategies. A woman who challenged local leaders, refused an unwanted marriage, or protected her autonomy could become entangled in accusations that escalated far beyond the original conflict. Political motives often merged with private grievances, creating accusations that blended official authority with personal vendettas. These situations rarely appeared in official records, but the patterns are undeniable. Whenever a woman threatened established expectations, the machinery of accusation turned with alarming precision. As we uncover these political layers, the image of the heretical woman takes on a new dimension. She was not simply a misunderstood figure caught in superstition, but a strategic target chosen to reinforce the power of those who feared losing influence. This perspective reveals how deeply intertwined politics and persecution were, shaping the conditions that made the next stages of her suffering not only possible, but inevitable. As hidden intentions continued to direct the narrative that awaited her, the brutality inflicted on women accused of heresy was far more extensive than the sparse records suggest. Chroniclers wrote as if torture were a rare and carefully regulated procedure, used only when absolutely necessary. But the reality hidden between the lines tells a very different story. Torture was neither exceptional nor controlled. It was a routine extension of interrogation, a method used not to uncover truth, but to shape it. And when the victims were women, the cruelty took on forms so disturbing that many scribes chose to omit the details entirely. What remains today are hints, gaps, and contradictions that reveal the magnitude of what was deliberately concealed. Women were subjected to techniques that exploited their physical vulnerability. The body of a woman was seen as a space where punishment could be inflicted without raising public outrage, as long as it occurred behind closed doors. This allowed interrogators to use methods that left minimal visible marks, ensuring that the final documents portrayed confessions as voluntary or spiritually inspired. Sleep deprivation, forced kneeling on sharp stones, and prolonged exposure to cold were employed with precision. These techniques exhausted the body and destabilized the mind, making resistance nearly impossible. Sexualized torture, though almost never recorded explicitly, appears in scattered testimonies and external accounts from observers horrified by what they witnessed. Women could be stripped, exposed, or violated under the justification of searching for physical marks of heresy. These so-called examinations were not medical procedures. They were strategic humiliations meant to break identity, dignity, and emotional stability. Chroniclers avoided describing these acts, not because they were unknown, but because documenting them would expose the cruelty of institutions that claimed divine authority. Another overlooked form of torture relied on psychological collapse. Interrogators threatened women with the suffering of their children, the destruction of their homes, or the shaming of their families. They manipulated fears unique to women in medieval societies, where reputation and honor could determine survival. The anguish of these threats often led women to confess to crimes they did not commit, simply to protect those they loved. Official documents present these confessions as evidence of guilt, never revealing the terror that produced them. The ritualization of torture added another layer of manipulation. Interrogators often framed their actions as spiritual correction, claiming that pain purified the soul or prevented eternal damnation. This distorted logic forced women into a mental conflict where resisting torture was portrayed as resisting salvation itself. When a woman finally broke under pressure, her confession was described as a sign of repentance rather than an outcome of calculated abuse. Scribes recorded the moment of confession with pious language, masking the violence that shaped every word she uttered. As these methods accumulated, they worked together to create a narrative that felt irrefutable. The woman's exhaustion, physical deterioration, and forced admissions aligned perfectly with the image authorities wanted to construct: a repentant heretic who had finally revealed her true nature. Yet beneath that illusion lies the truth of a process designed to ensure a single outcome. The violence itself became invisible, because the system depended on its invisibility to function. When we acknowledge these silenced forms of torture, the official records lose their aura of legitimacy. They become artifacts of manipulation rather than reflections of justice. And as we move forward, this understanding exposes why the next stages of persecution were able to unfold with such devastating certainty, shaped entirely by a narrative crafted long before the final verdict was ever declared. For many women accused of heresy, the true offense was not a forbidden belief or a ritual whispered in secret. It was the courage to speak, to question, to resist the roles imposed upon them. In a world where authority depended on silence and obedience, a woman who dared to articulate her own truth became a threat impossible to ignore. The system responded not by debating her words, but by transforming those words into evidence of rebellion. Truth itself turned into a form of defiance, and defiance was punished with a severity that history tried to soften or erase. Some of these women were educated, capable of interpreting religious texts or engaging in philosophical debate. Their knowledge was perceived not as a gift, but as an intrusion into spaces reserved for men. Once a woman demonstrated intellectual independence, her very presence unsettled the structures that upheld authority. Interrogators watched her closely, waiting for a statement that could be twisted into an admission of spiritual deviation. A single question voiced at the wrong moment could be reshaped into a declaration against divine doctrine. Truth, once spoken by a woman, lost its innocence, and became an accusation waiting to be weaponized. Other women had no formal education but possessed something equally dangerous: influence. They were community leaders, healers, counselors, or protectors of local traditions. People trusted them, confided in them, and sought them in moments of vulnerability. This quiet power challenged the hierarchy that demanded all answers flow through official channels. Authorities viewed such influence as a rival structure, and labeling these women as heretics provided a swift and effective way to dismantle their authority. By criminalizing their wisdom, institutions reclaimed the ground they felt slipping away. Even simple acts of autonomy could be interpreted as subversion. A woman who refused an arranged marriage, who chose not to remarry after widowhood, or who defended her property could be accused of resisting divine order. The system was designed so that female independence automatically suggested moral corruption. Once suspicion took shape, every action, every gesture, every silence became fuel for a narrative that portrayed these women as enemies of the spiritual and social world. What they said mattered far less than how their words could be rearranged to support a predetermined story. Confession, once extracted through pressure or fear, served as the final twist in transforming truth into crime. A woman who insisted on her innocence was accused of pride. A woman who expressed confusion was accused of hiding her true beliefs. A woman who broke under interrogation was described as revealing her real nature. No path offered safety. The system allowed truth only when it reinforced authority, and any version of reality presented by the accused was automatically rejected. Chroniclers later described these women as misguided or unstable, never acknowledging that their so-called instability was created by the same forces that destroyed their possibility of being heard. This transformation of truth into guilt served more than punitive purposes. It reinforced the message that resistance was dangerous, that questioning authority could unravel a life with frightening speed. Women learned to silence themselves, not because they lacked ideas, but because they understood the cost of expressing them. The system depended on this fear, using a few public examples to keep countless other voices subdued. As we get closer to the heart of these stories, it becomes impossible not to reflect on how many voices were erased simply because they carried truths that threatened power. And that reflection raises an essential question for us today. Tell me, what part of this silencing strikes you the most? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, your feelings, or your interpretation. Your voice helps illuminate what theirs were forced to hide, and together, we uncover what history tried so hard to keep buried in the shadows. While official documents describe trials as solemn procedures guided by religious duty, the truth behind these proceedings was far more clandestine and manipulative. Women accused of heresy were often judged in spaces that blurred the line between legality and secrecy, places where rules shifted depending on the outcome authorities wanted to produce. The courtroom was not a stage for truth, but a controlled environment where every detail worked against the accused. What remains today are fragments so carefully edited that only by examining the silences between them do we uncover the reality of these hidden trials. Many proceedings began without formal announcements, denying women the right to prepare or understand the accusations against them. They were summoned abruptly, sometimes in the dead of night, taken to chambers where only select officials were allowed. In these narrow rooms, the atmosphere itself was designed to intimidate. The lack of witnesses, the absence of advocates, and the unpredictability of each questioning created a psychological pressure that left the accused disoriented before the trial even began. Authorities presented these encounters as routine hearings, but they functioned as rehearsals for guilt. The composition of the tribunals revealed another layer of manipulation. Judges were chosen not for fairness but for loyalty, ensuring a unified perspective regardless of the evidence presented. Many had already reviewed the accusations beforehand, forming opinions long before hearing the woman's defense. When she spoke, Her words were filtered through a panel unwilling to consider her innocence. Each statement she made was transcribed selectively, shaped into narratives that aligned with the expectations of those in power. What she intended to say rarely matched what would later appear in the written record. Documents also show inconsistencies in the testimonies used against these women. Witnesses were often individuals who benefited from the accusation or feared repercussions if they remained silent. Their statements were accepted without scrutiny, while any defense from the accused was met with suspicion. This imbalance created a scenario where truth became irrelevant, and the trial was little more than a performance crafted to give the illusion of justice. The outcome had been decided long before the first question was asked. Even the physical space contributed to this manipulation. Trials were held in rooms where lighting, temperature, and proximity were controlled to heighten discomfort. Some women stood for hours, trembling from exhaustion or cold, while judges interpreted their shaking as signs of guilt. Averted eyes were described as deceit, trembling hands as spiritual agitation, and hesitation as proof of hidden doctrines. The environment itself became evidence, allowing interrogators to transform physical responses into moral judgments. When confessions emerged, they were celebrated as triumphs of spiritual guidance, yet they often resulted from relentless pressure and the cumulative weight of isolation. A woman who had been deprived of sleep, separated from her family, and threatened with punishment could easily be coerced into speaking words she did not believe. These confessions were recorded as proof of heresy, providing the justification for harsher measures. But what the documents do not reveal is the slow destruction that produced them. The secrecy surrounding these trials ensured that the public saw only the final verdict, never the machinery that engineered it. Once the judgment was announced, the woman's guilt appeared irrefutable, because nobody outside the chamber had witnessed the manipulation that led to it. Her voice was lost, replaced by a carefully constructed narrative that erased her perspective entirely. Understanding these concealed trials exposes the deeper truth behind persecution. It was not the accused who shaped their fate, but a system that operated with precision, silence, and intent. And as we continue to uncover the layers built around these women, we approach the moment where the consequences of these secret proceedings emerge with devastating clarity, revealing what society demanded from those it chose to condemn. The consequences faced by women accused of heresy extended far beyond the trial itself. Punishment was not limited to a verdict. It became a lifelong sentence designed to erase identity, disrupt communities, and serve as a warning to anyone who dared to challenge established norms. Medieval society used these cases not merely to discipline individuals, but to reinforce a system where female autonomy was perceived as a destabilizing force. The price of rebellion was calculated carefully, ensuring that the consequences spread across families, villages, and future generations. For many women, social death came long before any physical punishment. Once suspicion took hold, their reputations collapsed instantly. Friends distanced themselves, fearing association could invite scrutiny. Family members felt pressured to renounce them to protect their own standing. Even if a woman survived the formal proceedings, she returned to a community trained to view her as tainted. This silent exile stripped her of relationships, support, and dignity. Chroniclers rarely documented this aftermath, focusing instead on the trial's outcome. Yet the damage inflicted through social erasure was often the most devastating. Economic punishment intensified the impact of these accusations. Authorities frequently seized property, livestock, tools, or any item that could sustain a woman's independence. Under the guise of protecting the community from her supposed influence, her assets were redistributed to male relatives, the church, or local officials. This stripped her of the means to rebuild her life. A woman without property had few options, especially in a society where economic survival depended heavily on land and household stability. Even those acquitted faced poverty so severe that survival itself became uncertain. The threats extended beyond the accused woman to anyone connected to her. Families could be shunned, children removed, and marriages annulled. The stigma attached to heresy lingered long after the trial, marking entire bloodlines as suspect. Communities used this fear to maintain obedience and discourage dissent among younger women who witnessed the consequences. The message was unmistakable. Even proximity to disobedience could destroy a life. This intergenerational impact ensured that the control exerted through a single accusation reverberated long after the woman's voice had been silenced. Physical punishment, when imposed, served as both spectacle and warning. Public penance rituals forced women to walk through villages in garments designed to shame them. Whipping, branding, or confinement in harsh conditions followed. Chroniclers preferred to describe these acts with sanitized phrasing, portraying them as moral correction rather than cruelty. Yet the reality was unmistakable. These punishments aimed to break spirit and body alike. Each act reinforced the notion that female defiance required not just suppression, but complete erasure of autonomy. Even after completing their sentences, many women found themselves living on the margins, monitored by authorities who viewed them as permanent risks. They could be summoned at any time, questioned, or forced into additional humiliating rituals. Their existence became a cycle of surveillance, where any misstep could reignite accusations. Life after persecution was not freedom, but a suspended state of fear, shaped by the knowledge that redemption was almost never granted to a woman who had challenged power. Understanding this price of rebellion reveals the deeper intention behind persecution. It was not simply about silencing one woman. It was about shaping the behavior of all women. Her suffering became a lesson, a warning, a boundary that others were expected to fear. And as we recognize the full weight of what these women endured, we get closer to confronting the final, most disturbing truth hidden beneath centuries of silence, where the darkest consequences of these accusations came into full view. The culmination of centuries of hidden persecution reveals a pattern that is both shocking and instructive. Women accused of heresy were never just accused. They were made examples. Every step, from the secret interrogations to manipulated trials, from invisible tortures to public punishments, was orchestrated to maintain a rigid social order. What history often left unspoken was the meticulous precision with which power dismantled lives, leaving no trace beyond the carefully curated official records. These women were erased from the visible record, yet their existence, resistance, and suffering persisted beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. By examining these final stages, we uncover how the machinery of suppression worked not only to punish, but to terrorize entire communities. Families learned that association with a single woman could result in lasting repercussions. Communities absorbed lessons of obedience, coercion, and fear that ensured compliance with the prevailing authority. Every arrest, every confession, every punishment was a message. Step out of line, and the consequences would ripple far beyond your own life. And these lessons were so effective because they operated silently, invisibly, through fear and social pressure, rather than overt confrontation. The deeper tragedy is not only in the immediate suffering, but in the stories that were lost. Chronicles sanitized events, erasing names, disguising acts, and reframing narratives to suit the powers that wrote them. What remains today are fragments, hints, and faint traces that challenge us to reconstruct the reality. Archaeological evidence, scattered testimonies, and overlooked manuscripts offer glimpses into the full scope of oppression. Every detail we recover paints a picture of a systematic effort to control, punish, and silence women across generations. Yet amid this darkness, we find resilience. Some women survived, adapted, and even found ways to preserve knowledge and faith in secret. Their courage, often unrecorded, left subtle marks on communities and objects, reminding future generations that even under the harshest conditions, defiance was possible. These hidden acts of resistance reveal that while power can erase, it cannot fully obliterate human agency, memory, or spirit. History may have intended for these voices to vanish, but careful study brings them back into light, allowing us to bear witness to what was once concealed. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you've witnessed the extraordinary lengths to which institutions went to silence women, and the remarkable resilience these women showed in return. Now I want to hear from you. Leave a comment saying, "This message was for me," if this story struck you, and share your thoughts on what resonates most. Make sure you're subscribed so you can continue uncovering hidden truths like this, and give a like to support bringing these forgotten histories to light. There's a video here beside this one that complements everything you've just learned. Click and continue with me. It will take you even deeper into the realities history tried to conceal, revealing patterns of power and resistance that shaped centuries.